Go into investing in developing new digital tools is a very risky investment. It's possible to develop tools. We have seen that. I think there are hundreds, I think in Africa, probably more than 500 different tools developed over the past couple of decades. But they are difficult to sustain, and they are challenging to get to scale. So what we see is that they have different types of challenges. For the public sector, they are strongest in the early development phase. They do very well in developing the apps. They have normally good international partnerships, or they have a good resource endowment. But when it comes to operational and scaling, they find they are not as successful. While the private sector often has challenges in the beginning because it's time consuming, it's resource demanding, before you get to a scale that it's a viable business. So they have difficulties in the startup phase, but for the ones of them that goes to scale and get a good business model, once they come to that level, they are doing much better than the private sector. A lot of the things that are flagged in the beginning is all the challenges and difficulties. With more than 90% failing, of course, the challenges comes up front. But what for us was interesting was to acknowledge that everybody has this type of challenges, but despite this type of challenges, somebody still succeeds. And why are they doing that? That was the Columbus Egg we were trying to investigate. As a guide, we used what is called the Principle for Digital Development, which is sort of a community of people who have gone together some years back and said, what do we actually need to think about when we develop digital tools? So we have not used this one-to-one, but we have sort of been inspired by it. So they have a 9-step process. If you Google Principles for Digital Development, you can find there's a whole website about this that can inspire you and that you can work with if you're in this line of business. What is the first step you need to do? Design with the users. We call it form a team with the right skills. And what we see is that user involvement in design phase, that is critically important, but especially when you are working in a rural setting and in a developing world setting, you have the challenges that the users are very little or no ICT literacy. So they might actually not understand what it is that you are trying to do with them. When we talk about users, the public sector tends to see them as beneficiary, people who should be grateful that they are supported, and that is actually not a very good way of involving the users. While we see with the private sector, they have a fundamentally different view on the users. They see them as customers. And in order to have a successful business, your customer needs to be satisfied. So they have a better approach to how they integrate and involve the users right from the start and throughout the process. We also see that the public tends to be bigger, more blueprint-oriented, more top-down, while private initiatives doesn't have the time for long top-down blueprints, so they are more iterative and works with a more trial and error. So again, this gives an advantage to private sector-led initiatives. Then forming the team with the right skills, one of the things that come up as a challenge basically everywhere, but especially in Africa, was the access to good programmers. And that is clearly a private sector constraint because they are in short supply, they are hard to retain, they're very costly. Then in the initial finding of partners, one of the first partners to come in is very often the mobile service providers, which are the private sector ones. So this is a strength to have them on board from the beginning because it also increases your outreach. So assessing the enabling environment, which is the next step in the understanding the existing ecosystem, it's called in the principles. We see here that this is quite resource demanding and the enabling environment is not a static thing. a very dynamic thing. So this is a challenge for the private sector in the beginning to have sufficient resources to understand what's going on, what are the environment, the ecosystem that we are operating in. And we see clearly that public sector has more resources. They can draw from other parts of the public sector to get support. They might have international partners, they might have donor support, so they have a much stronger setting for that. Then when we look at the policy environment, we could see that in Asia, it was relatively better than in Africa and in Latin America. We think that it might be partly due to stable governments, functioning public institutions, well-educated civil servants that are seeing and maybe also a little bit further on the digitalization than the other regions. But these are only indicative. You cannot use digitalization to compensate for weaknesses. And we clearly see that in Africa, overall, no surprise to anyone, that both public NGO, CBO, and private sector-led advisory service systems are weaker than in the other two regions that we looked at. And doing digitalization, we do see that it requires a human interface in many places because of the low ICT literacy at farmer level. So in order for it to work, you often have to have somebody, and that I could see in a comment from Access Agriculture that using this human interface in the local environment is actually a job opportunity for young people and a retention of young people in the rural society. And we see that very clearly private sector driven initiatives, less so with the public sector driven initiatives. Clearly the private sector see the need for having paid staff, or not staff, but paid people who can be sort of the interface between the technology and the farmer present in the local society. And that the targeting poor, it's difficult. It's difficult for the private sector because it's difficult to build a sustainable business model around a very poor farmer. It is the public sector is in a better situation in reaching the poor, but since generally what we see is that maintaining and expanding. So in the first development phase, the focus very often from the public sector is towards the poor people. But if they are donor driven, and then the donors pull out, the government system doesn't have the resources to maintain and operate the system. Or we often see in public systems that there are political changes. So even well-functioning system can be subject either to change of government or restructuring of public institutions. So they do have some challenges there. So even though they are better in targeting the poor, they also have challenges in doing that. What are the advantages of being public sector driven? You have institutional anchoring, you have a broad target group, you have access to international partners, and you have at least the potential to go to scale. One of the reasons that they don't get such a big reach is that they are based on the public system. So for example, helplines are not open after 5 o'clock in the afternoon. They are not open in the weekend. They are not open on public holidays, which really doesn't work for farmers. And as said before, they are prone to political changes, and they are costly because they don't really have a revenue. Most of them doesn't have a strong business model and revenue scheme. So the public sector has to put money into it continuously, and they tend to have weak feedback systems. Private sector, they are more demand driven. They have good feedback system. They often have the ones that are successful have a clear business model. They are interesting for the local commercial partners, and they actually have the ability to go scale, but they have difficulties in finding investors and maintaining them. They are mainly targeting the commercial interesting farmers, which makes them less interesting for development partners and maybe also for the government. And then there's the whole issue around data ownership and rights, which need to be addressed. What we clearly see is that the ones that have gone successful, being it public or private, they have a variety of different services. So you have to bundle services that cater for farmers' different needs. That can be advisory service, input supply, outlet for your products, weather forecast, market analysis, access to credit, and so on. So the more services that the farmers can find within one app or one platform, the more likely it is the farmer will use it. Both public and private, but we clearly see that the private sector have an advantage here because we have this closer loops and feedback and are more nimble to take in new partnerships, do new things. They need to have a solid business model. Again, the private sector have an upper hand here. Service free for small scale farmers, this is actually both possible in the public and the private sector. But of course, the public sector have an upper hand here. Inbuilt feedback mechanisms, I've talked about that. The private sector is clearly stronger here. And functional human technology interface at local level, we predominantly see the private sector running this. So we see different kinds of business models. I won't go into the details. There's more details in the report. The free public system is mainly seen in Asia and in Africa. Then there's the fee paying, that people pay a fee. It's seen several places. Input supplier companies pays for access. That is mainly the private sector who has this modality. Then it can be through advertising, that you are using the platform. The more farmers you reach, the more interesting you are as an advertising platform. Then in Latin America, where we have producer organizations which have a high turnover of products, they can run the services through the fee on products. And then you are developing public-private partnership. I think it would be important to look on a variety of these ones. Do not depend only on one of these models, but have different parts using different things for different customer groups. That seems to be the one that works the best. When you roll out, and it's very important that there are feedback mechanisms and you keep adapting, expanding, adjusting, make it more user-friendly. And we see that the public sector-led services, I have said this before, they are a little bit slow in reacting to beneficiaries' comments, while the private sector has to do it because it's their customers, and customers need to be satisfied, and thereby they keep looking at their own data. So the development of the service portfolio and of the value or the smoothness of the service is very much driven by the feedback data from the users. Either the users can be extension officers, or the users can be local people hired to be this intermediate, or it can be directly through feedback surveys from the customers. For the public sector, it really has to work on the enabling environment. I think it's more important that the public sector work on an enabling environment, that they are trying to do the services by themselves. If they are wanting to do the services, it should be through public-private partnership. They should create a policy framework for private sector, non-for-profit actors also to be there. And they should, of course, address the issue of data governance and data security. Then there's a huge area of training and capacity building that basically came up everywhere, that the low ICT literacy at extension level and at farmer level is a prohibitor, and that is where GFRAS can come in with our global network. We do a lot on professionalization and capacity building, so that's where we should have a comparative advantage. Sharing successful business models for private public partnerships. I think we are trying to do that with this, and we will continue to try to do that. And then the public sector should also help accessing to relevant updated data, which is the big challenge for many countries. The poorer the country, the more difficult it is to have good, relevant, free access to data. So for the global community, being a little bit provocative here, stop reinventing and wasting your money, start investing. And if you want to invest, look at the ones that are already functioning and help them with scaling. And it shouldn't matter if they are public, private, combination, non-profit. Go for the one that is the 0.5% that is successful. That's where you should put your money. If you want to invest in this new initiative, we recommend that you try to develop initiatives, public-private initiatives, where we have the public sector being dominant startup phase and then gradually taking over by the private sector in the operational and running phase. And we will also be advocating this and be talking about this going forward as a community. Thank you very much.